Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our series on the history of bad ideas, we're going to be talking about an idea that is probably the most recent of all the ones we've discussed in this series. It didn't really exist until the very end of the 20th century, and it's only really taken off in the last few years. But now that it's become widespread, it's also really hard to avoid. I'm talking to the American historian Gary Gerstle about what's wrong with the idea that we are living in the Polycrisis. Gary, we're talking about an idea today which, in the context of this series, is, I think, by some distance the most recent idea. It has the most recent coinage, Polycrisis. As a word, my understanding of it, it was first used right at the end of the last century, the end of the 20th century. It started to be used 1998, 1999, I think, are the first two times. It probably had been around before, but got picked up originally in French writing about the ecological crisis by authors who wanted to say it's a mistake to think that the crisis facing planet Earth is a single crisis. So we shouldn't think of it as the environmental crisis or the climate change crisis. They wanted to say it is multiple overlapping crises, and it's really important to recognize that alongside climate change is the crisis of capitalism. They thought the population crisis, that already looks a bit dated actually, the crisis of insane technological development, breakneck technology, breakneck growth, the crisis of democracy. One of the things that's interesting about that is this term polycrisis emerged at a period, the end of the 1990s, that we now look back on as the golden age, when the world didn't have so much to worry about. So that's one thing I'm interested in here. But what do you take from the origin story here of the word polycrisis? It comes out of that attempt to say at the end of the 20th century that there's not just an environmental crisis, there's not one, there are many, and we have to always talk about them in conjunction with each other. What do you think was going on back then?
Well, I think we don't know enough about the origins because the originators were two French scholars, Edgar Morin and Brigitte Kern, and the book in which the Polycrisis first appeared was published in French in 1993.
Okay, so when I think it's 98, 99, that's when it got picked up in English, I think.
Yes, it got translated in 1999, and it speaks to the limited linguistic facilities of the Anglo-American world that we think its origins dates just at the point of the translation. And we don't really know enough about what the internal discussion in French scholarly circles was like in the 1990s, and it seems important to recover that. But placing this in the early 90s makes a difference from the end of the 1990s, because I think the early 90s are a much more uncertain time. And here, Morin's history as not just a scholar, but as a political activist, he had been a member of the French Communist Party. He had been very, very active in all kinds of politics, dating back to the resistance in the Algerian War. And we might theorize that the fall of communism in 1989 may have something to do with his sense of a new world coming. He was a theorist of complexity. He was a philosopher of complexity. I'm not sure he was looking to apply things immediately to problems of the 1990s. And there are suggestions in that book that the polycrisis to which he referred to was not an immediate effect of the 1990s, but really a manifestation of modernity, of technological developments, of acceleration of speed, of transmission of ideas, of globalization that presented people with so much more information and created genuine problems of interpretation, understanding the impact of one system and another. So I think we should see it both as a product of the early 90s and perhaps a recognition that the world had changed with the fall of communism, and also a series of meditations on the condition of modernity, or perhaps post-modernity, which was a term gaining a lot of currency at that time, especially at that time in French circles.
Do you think early 90s as well as late 90s, it had anything to do with a sense that we had entered an age which was at the end of ideology, because particularly interestingly, if he had been a member of the Communist Party as a Marxist, people have always understood that there are multiple overlapping crises that can take place at one time. And it's probably a mistake just to think that everything is about the one thing that's in front of you. But in the age of ideology, it was also often assumed that behind these different crises was a single explanation, a kind of monocausal account. You could say, you're seeing this, you're seeing this, you're seeing this, and you're seeing this, and you're right to notice that it's happening across the piece, but behind it is the class struggle. For example, it doesn't have to be that ideology, but it could be that ideology. Or alternatively, I mean, it could be other ideologies as well. And by the 1990s, there was a feeling that it's not going to work anymore to think that we can find a single explanation, because these ideologies have in some ways been exhausted or exploded. And yet we are still facing these multiple crises. So maybe what we need to be thinking is less what single thing lies behind them all, and more how are they interacting with each other? And is actually the thing that we're looking at here the interplay between these different things? Because I think the idea of the polycrisis assumes that what's important is to recognize that all of these things impact on each other, and in some ways might be more than the sum of their parts as well. The polycrisis is what happens when all of these crises happen at the same time. So it's almost looking forward to the ways in which they feed off each other, rather than looking back at the ways in which they all feed off a single source. Do you think, am I reading explanation into what may just be a coincidence, but it feels like it does rather fit not the end of history, but the end of ideology as people came to understand it in the 1990s?
I think it's certainly plausible, and when Fukuyama is writing about the end of history, he's not really writing about the end of history. He's writing about the end of ideology as a motive force in history, and this is precisely the moment when Fukuyama is writing, and if we might imagine what are the ramifications of the collapse of communism elsewhere in the world. And part of what the collapse of the communist experiment in the Soviet Union does is it takes revolution off the table. So it takes the monocausal explanation for everything off the table, but it also takes a technique for addressing what seems to be a blizzard of problems and challenges, all of which could be resolved by a revolutionary party with the ambition of ending capitalism and transitioning to socialism. That gets taken off the table in a very powerful and meaningful way in the 1990s. There may be another way in which a vestige of Marxist thinking survives, however, and that has to do not with revolution, but it has to do with grasping the totality of the situation. Marxist analysis has always been very concerned with getting to the root of things. And yes, at the end of the day, it would come to capitalism, but it was also very intent on connecting disparate elements of social and political life and economic life that too many other commentators had left as disparate. And part of the Marxist project was to demonstrate that there were connections between these different layers, these different manifestations, these different systems. And so it's possible that one of the ways in which Marxist influence survives is the insistence that we must understand the complexity of this situation, even if simple or clear solutions, end capitalism, transition to socialism, have a revolution, has to be taken off the table.
So we're going to come on to the ways in which we think, maybe we think similarly or maybe we think differently, I don't know. The ways in which we think it doesn't work or maybe doesn't help, that might be another way to put it. But even as you describe it there, I'm beginning to feel uncomfortable with the idea of polycrisis, because it feels, if nothing else, quite challenging to be told, you've got to see how it all connects, and yet we're not going to be in a position to identify what the connecting thing is. So you need to recognize the ways in which all of these things connect with each other, feed off each other. We mustn't focus on one thing at the expense of anything else. And yet we're also not going to be able to tell you that behind this complexity is something that cuts through it. And on the one hand, I can see that might be quite realistic. On the other hand, it sounds like it's not a million miles away from a counsel of despair, in that it's saying complexity is everything, but complexity is also sufficient to blow any simpler explanations out of the water. So we're going to be in the jungle of complexity from here on in.
I think there's a real strain of pessimism that runs through the polycrisis paradigm, that things are so complex and so unpredictable, and things are layered. A crisis in one area layers on a crisis in another area in ways that are hard to fathom. And even if we do fathom them, we can't necessarily predict what the effect of that's going to be or how to address it. It's interesting in this regard that even after the translation of the Polycrisis book, it doesn't really catch on in the Anglo-American, or let's call it the English language world. The use of the polycrisis doesn't really begin to take off until after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And then it's given another jolt in 2016, one of the nightmare years for the European Union, when the head of the European Commission, Juncker, invokes it to refer to the global financial crisis, the European debt crisis, Brexit, Ukraine, all these crises hitting simultaneously. And it seems to me that his picking up that term in 2016 marks the point of departure for this entering political discourse and intellectual discourse in a major way. And then it takes another leap forward during the COVID years. And the despair of COVID, the overwhelming sense of we can't do anything about this except stay home and think of ways of avoiding despair and taking the same walk around the neighborhood that we've been taking for the last 100 days. And underneath all this, of course, is the climate crisis, which reaches a kind of crescendo, I would say, between 2016 and the Paris Accords of those years and the COVID years. And if there's anything really outstandingly new that would justify developing and popularizing the idea of polycrisis, it's not so much the existence of multiple crises. We can find other instances where there were just as many, perhaps more crises in the world. And I have one example that we can get to if you want to go to that in the early 20th century United States. But if there's something new that is represented in the concept of polycrisis, it's the existential crisis posed by the possibility of planetary extinction. And I think this runs through a lot of thinking about the polycrisis and again injects a lot of pessimism into the discussion. Now, I would also say that when one first encounters a concept of polycrisis, it's very empowering. It's very seductive. It promises a way of understanding things in the world that perhaps previously eluded one, because one can begin to connect things in different areas, and one has the hope initially that greater understanding will lead to an easier way of acting upon the world. But I think actually that is not what happens when one embraces the polycrisis paradigm, because within that paradigm, I haven't seen it, and there may be people who are working on this paradigm trying to make it something actionable. But how do you turn a perception that we are in a polycrisis to a confident program for going forward? How does one take the impact of one crisis on another crisis and develop from that a way of advancing the world in a direction that one would want to see? I'm a historian. I have examples from the past of activists, reformers, revolutionaries dealing with polycrises, not calling it that because they didn't have the terminology, but effectively saying there are too many crises that confront us. Here's the crucial one we have to focus on. We're going to ignore this crisis and that crisis for the sake of fundamentally addressing what we take to be the core problem in front of us. You don't see that kind of language coming out of people who've embraced the polycrisis paradigm, which leads me to think it's ultimately a spur more to pessimism than to offering a way forward in the world.
So I want to come on to that, and also the question of historical examples when we might draw parallels with earlier polycrises when people weren't using the term. But that little history you gave is very interesting. So from the French origins of it, the translation, it doesn't really take off, and then it takes off post-financial crisis, particularly when Juncker uses it in 2016. And then after COVID, Adam Tooze, I think, helped popularize the term, particularly in an article he wrote in the Financial Times in 2022. So like with the financial crisis, it's not at the heart of the crisis that people are using it. It's kind of coming out of the crisis, it's emerging from it and seeing that, well, we might be past the worst of that, but my God, we're still facing a lot of other things. And actually, even being past the worst of that, having dealt with that, we're almost at sea because our energies in dealing with that have left us exposed to all of these other things. It feels to me it's after we've walked around the block for 100 days, it's looking around. That's when people go, wow, it's a polycrisis because they've let me out of my home and it's still a real mess. But the Juncker example is interesting because the original French version of this is really cosmic, as you said. It's not about the 1990s, it's about modernity, it's about the fate of the planet. And the appeal of it, and it's probably a pessimistic appeal, is that existential strain. Yet the Juncker version is very parochial. He's worried about the European Union. One of his polycrises is Brexit. Now, you can have all sorts of views about Brexit, but I don't think it threatens the future of the planet. I don't think it did then. I don't think it does now. It almost feels like he's facing a very, very difficult situation, political situation, but he's slightly bigging it up by calling it a polycrisis. And that then feeds into the question even post-COVID, which is, it does feel like a term that's come to be used not about modernity, but trying to say there's something particularly challenging for us now. We're in the heart of this thing. The polycrisis is our crisis. We're going to take this word and we're going to run with it because we think it says something about us. And that's where I start to feel, well, if we take a broader view of this, I think people could have said that during any decade of the 20th century and any decade of the 21st, including the so-called peaceful ones, like the 1990s. I mean, the examples that you're thinking of, you said early 20th century, but I'm also thinking the 1940s, not the first half, but the second half of the 1940s. That was a polycrisis. The origins of the Cold War simultaneously with all of the other things that were going on, end of empire, the rest of it, and fundamental shifts in the global economy. The 1950s were a polycrisis. The 1960s were a polycrisis. So one of my problems with it is it feels a little narcissistic, actually. Unless you want to go back to that French origin of it and say, we're not really just talking about us, we're talking about a way of thinking about interconnections in a more of a sort of longue durée perspective of what is really at stake here in an age where our habitat, the natural world is at risk. But that's not what Juncker's talking about. Juncker's not worrying about a habitable Earth when he uses the term polycrisis. Adam Tooze may have been, but Juncker wasn't. So that's where I start to get quite uncomfortable with it. Do you think I'm wrong to think it's narcissistic?
I would use a slightly more neutral term, therapeutic rather than narcissistic, as a way of coping with a time where there seem to be problems that can't be solved. And here again, I want to stress the importance of the climate issue and the existential angst that causes. And if you imagine COVID piled onto the climate crisis, and we are now not in the world is in the same climate crisis, but the intensity of consciousness about it is not what it was in the early 2020s, when there was a peak concern both about the climate crisis and COVID hitting people at the same time. And both of them forced humans to face possibilities of extinction, the COVID on a personal level and the climate crisis on a species level. And I think that is the moment where I think the polycrisis language just explodes. And it provides a kind of comfort in what many people felt was really a very difficult time. For Juncker, he's a politician. He's not a thinker. I believe he declares his polycrisis to be over in 2018. It may be that his deployment of the term is actually much more useful because it refers to a politician really in 2016 dealing with something that seems unmanageable and how's he going to manage it. And 2 years later, that sense of crisis has passed, and now he doesn't have 4 or 5 crises. Maybe he has 1 or 2, and the European Union is finding its way beyond Brexit and feels that it can survive. So that might actually be a more useful way of thinking about it. I am attracted to the original Morin conception of this as this being a meditation on modernity, which would encompass the last 100 to 150 years. But that's not how Adam Tooze and others think about the deployment of the climate crisis. For them, it's something that's happened in the last 15 or 20 or 25 years and speaks to an urgent problem of the 21st century. And thus, it's not about modernity per se, although it would be interesting to bring a discussion of modernity and its effects back into the discourse about the polycrisis. That would be an interesting move to make, to bring the original tract that has inspired so much conversation back into our conversation and to see if there are deeper insights there that might prove enduring and might prove illuminating in terms of explaining the moment in which we are living.
I want to just ask you about that word therapeutic, because So it depends what we mean, and I don't think we're using it in a sort of technical, professional sense. But I do understand the ways in which calling it a polycrisis might be consoling, but these are the consolations of despair, essentially. I think actually it seems like a term that's suited to the scale, the overwhelming scale of the challenge. It's almost like the consolation of we're going to see and acknowledge that this thing is as big as you feel it is and as complicated and as overwhelming as you feel it is. But therapeutic also implies the ability to help, essentially. And if you think of an individual, one can totally imagine this language in the context of an individual life. We all suffer crises, and sometimes it feels like we're suffering 4 or 5 crises at the same time. They're interconnected. It's not completely clear which one we should focus on. It's not clear there's a single cause, a monoclausal explanation, never mind the class struggle, but whatever the thing that you did that made your life fall apart. But the idea that calling it a polycrisis would help seems to me quite remote, in the sense that the help that you want is the thing that you just described in the earlier 20th century version of this, people feeling overwhelmed by an overlapping set of crises and not sure they could find a single underlying explanation. What you'd advise your friend to do, never mind whether you're a therapist, just as a friend, is, well, start with the one you can deal with. Don't tell yourself it's a polycrisis, because you're going to probably be paralyzed by that thought. But try and disaggregate it. And I hesitate to sort of draw direct analogies between individual lives and the lives of polities or the planet, but it does feel like some of those problems do cut across, move across. The danger of calling it the polycrisis is the consolation is not helpful, because it does invite the possibility that the person, the thing, the entity that is suffering the polycrisis will feel powerless.
Yes, and I'm not a therapist, obviously, and if I have misused the word to the therapists who are listening, I apologize.
I'm taking it we're both using it in a generic, not in a technical sense.
Yeah, by therapeutic, I mean an alternative to politics. That's how I'm thinking of it. What does one do if one doesn't see a political solution to a problem? There can be therapies that help one live with the problems without solving the problems. And in order to move someone from a therapeutic state to a political state, you have to be able to offer them a political program. And as I think about the polycrises of the early 20th century, 100, 125 years ago, I'm struck both by similarities and differences. And the differences lie in a kind of political hope that I don't think exists nearly as vigorously among liberals and the left as it did 125 years ago. If I think of America in 1900, it's being torn apart by labor violence. There are regular efforts to assassinate leading robber barons and presidents. Some of these actions are successful. There's a perception of an immigration crisis. America's borders are open. It's being overwhelmed by awful immigrants. These are the immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe who are Catholic and Jewish and anarchist and Bolshevik, and they're not fitting in. They're not assimilable. There's the question of the trusts and monopoly power and capitalism driving the world into conflicts from which it can't recover. There's the race question. They didn't call them crises then. They called them questions. There was a labor question. There was a race question. Race relations in American society are pretty vicious at this time. This is also the time of the woman question. What's the place of women and feminism going to be in American society? And all these issues are there before you get the crisis and crucible of the First World War, which seems to blow up everything, even in the United States, which comes through the war comparatively unscathed relative to the European combatants. And then you get the pandemic, which killed perhaps maybe 50 times as many people as COVID killed. So this is a moment where there are crises everywhere you look, and people are aware of the crises. They are talking about them constantly, but there's much less despair and there's much less pessimism. If you look at the reformers who are going to call themselves progressives, and then in Franklin Roosevelt's time, they're going to call themselves liberals, they have tremendous sense of confidence. They can use the tools of social science, politics, democracy to solve problems. And then, my God, in the middle of this, you have hopes of revolution, and then a successful revolution, or one that appeared to be successful in Russia in 1917, generates extraordinary hope around the world. And I think also of Wilson's 14 points and traveling to Europe for Versailles and the hopes generated by that Wilsonian moment. Those hopes turned out to be short-lived because he was not promising self-determination to many peoples outside of the European continent and North America. But the crises of that moment generated tremendous amount of optimism. So if I look for the difference between then and now, it's not in the number of crises. If anything, there were more crises then, but there was also a tremendous amount of hope that liberals and leftists would find a way to a solution. They had the political programs that if they achieved political power, there would be solutions to these crises and the world would reach a different place.
So I want to come on to what might be a difference, and you've touched on it already, which is maybe there were more crises and they were overwhelming potentially for the people living through them. They weren't planet-ending. I mean, so the framing as planet-ending does seem like it is an important part of this later register. But a couple of other things occurred to me as you were describing that period. So the first is, it does make a difference that they're called questions and not crises. One difference is that it wouldn't make sense to say, well, we've got all these different questions, so the way to think about it is the poly question. That's just a nonsense, right? It almost illustrates the ways in which it's not completely clear what is gained by amalgamating them all under the poly umbrella, because in the case of questions, well, it doesn't make sense. What is the poly question? I don't think that means anything. So it may actually make a difference that it's questions, not crises. But I also found myself thinking about Britain in this period, because there's a myth that before the First World War, late Edwardian Britain, it was cucumber sandwiches for tea and croquet on the lawn and canes living a luxurious life. And then the First World War came and blew it up. Pre-1914 Britain, particularly from 1911 to 1914, it's often described by historians as a period of almost extraordinary turmoil, because the turmoil was coming from all these different directions, very similar to what you described for the United States. Radical suffragism, bordering on terrorism, women fighting for the vote, civil war in Northern Ireland, the risk of civil war, violent industrial unrest, the empire creaking. Gandhi is already doing his work before the First World War. Global capitalism itself, people already recognizing vulnerable in various ways, the risks of revolutionary politics. The seduction of that, it was a golden summer and then the First World War came, is partly a reflection of the sense at the time that, and this is for real, this is not just hindsight people had, which was, God, it's overwhelming, but then here's a war, that clarifies things. And there is a dangerous seduction, I think, possibly to this feeling that we're in this multiple overlapping crisis. We're not looking for monocausal explanations, but we are looking for clarifying events. And the First World War, seen from a later perspective, is just another crisis on top of all these others. But at the time, certainly in Britain, there was absolutely a feeling, Churchill and others articulated it, which was an overwhelming politics was suddenly clarified. And it also makes me think of Tony Blair. If you read Tony Blair's memoir, his description of watching the planes hit the Twin Towers, he sort of describes a world pre-2001, which for him actually was a kind of polycrisis world. He didn't know how to deal with all the different things that were on his plate. And then an event happened, which he said was spectacularly clarifying for him, because it allowed him to join all the dots. That's the language that he used. And to see that everything was connected, but also it was connected in a way that there could be a single struggle, which was going to be the war on terror. I have a feeling, an instinct that maybe not the language of polycrisis, but the mindset is a little bit exposed to being seduced by clarifying events. Do you think that might be right? I mean, we haven't had one yet, so we haven't had the post-COVID clarifying event. But the fact that there might be a pull of these events, I don't think the First World War was caused by people wanting to get out of the polycrisis. But it did seduce people who'd been living through the polycrisis into thinking, well, at least now we've got an event that sort of puts that all into one box.
Well, I think there's a difference between a clarifying event that gives you a political way forward and a clarifying event that just compounds a sense of impotence and that you can't move. What I heard you when you were describing Tony Blair's clarifying event, my reaction to that was to think he got well, he didn't get the clarifying event wrong, but he got the linkages wrong. And if this was his clarifying event that reoriented him in terms of his politics, what I hear you saying is the danger of being seduced by imputing to an event the wrong meaning or taking from it a wrong political path. And I would say that, and I'm not an expert on Britain, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I see his clarifying event as being the moment when Tony Blair lost his way as a politician. So what was clarifying for him was not clarifying for the British people and was certainly not clarifying, I would say, for the world in terms of what resulted from that. I would come back to the question of politics and the adequacy of politics. And here's something else I've been thinking about that I want to throw at you and you can and have you react to it because I'm not sure what to do with it. I don't see talk of polycrisis on the right. I see it in the center and the left. The center here, I'm thinking of the World Economic Forum, which picks up polycrisis in a big way in 2023. I think it speaks to an exhaustion of a certain kind of politics on the left. I don't sense that on the right, insofar as there is revolutionary ardor in the world today of the sort that once existed on the left. I see it on the right. Living with a zealous group of radicals in the White House who want to build a radically different political order from the one that currently exists in the United States. Now, the Biden people also had visions of a very different political order, but I see the ardor and zeal characteristic of the current inhabitants of the White House and their supporters. And imagine the world that they want to create. They want to roll the world back to around 1900 and that imperial age and pre-welfare state, pre-New Deal. It's not just a matter of eliminating woke in the last 10 or 15 years or putting universities in their place. It's rolling back of a century of what they take to be progressive advances.
And as you've just described it, they want to go from this polycrisis back to that one, which suggests they're very comfortable with polycrisis conditions.
Yes, and they have a confidence and a politics that gives them the assurance that they can find their way through this very bewildering world. So I think making that distinction between liberals on the left on the one hand and people on the right on the other, I sense considerably more energy and conviction and assurance on the right than I do on the left. And this brings back to a point you made earlier, which is why I think there's a tendency among those who have embraced the polycrisis to embrace a politics of despair and a sense of having exhausted the politics that buoyed these movements for pretty much an entire century.
So the point I'm going to make is not exclusively about the right by any means, but it is clearly a feature of our world, which is after the end of the age of ideology and those kind of monocausal explanations, people who wanted to join the dots had to do so in different ways. So I gave the example of Tony Blair, who almost literally says this event allowed him to see how everything was connected. But there's clearly another strand of that, which is that there is political energy among people who maybe they don't see a single causal explanation, but they see a single, and I'm going to use the word, conspiracy that connects the dots. There's a way in which people want to say all these different things are happening, but actually, if you dig deep enough, you won't find the class struggle at the basis of it, but you will find this event, this act, this lie. And actually, for some of them, it goes back to what Blair did over Iraq. That's part of the background to the age in which we live. And there is that energy in our politics, but it is, I think, generally fairly futile energy. I don't think a conspiratorial mindset generates the kind of political energy that you're talking about, but it does allow certain people, and I think this is true of some people who are now in power in the United States, to find their way through multiple overlapping crises, not necessarily by doing the thing that you described people did 120 years ago, which is to identify the one that you could tackle first and have a clearly worked out sense of what's achievable, what isn't achievable, where the hope really lies. But more that, I'd say it's closer to the paranoid style in American politics, that feeling that, yeah, we can cut through this thicket because we know where the bodies are buried, that kind of mindset. And it is one of the features of our time that there is a lot of political energy around that way of thinking. It's there in left and right populisms, so not by no means just on the right. But it is where the energy is, not exclusively. And that seems to me a big difference from both the earlier period you described, but also the ages of ideology that maybe came in between.
So you're saying these conspiracies filling a void that ideologies perhaps have vacated.
What do you do when you're confronted with being told you're living in a polycrisis in which each crisis feeds off the other crises and the overall polycrisis is greater than the sum of its parts and it threatens the future of everything? You could despair. and you're told, we're not going to give you the old political explanations for this because they don't carry water anymore. And you're living in the age of the internet. I think one of the things you're going to do, I can relate to this, I think we can all relate to this, is rather than try to say, where is there hope? Where is there a practical possibility of change? Where can consensus be achieved? Or alternatively, where do we just have to hold our ground and say this is what we believe in? You still look for something that can make sense of it all, but you look for it by looking for the thing that you think is the hidden thing that helps you see through it. And maybe it's still a minority pursuit, but it is in some ways the dominant mode of expression in certain areas of our public discourse online.
And maybe expressive of a different kind of despair, right? That one doesn't see a reasonable way forward. It's a different way of connecting the dots, and I think connecting the dots is an interesting metaphor for thinking about politics, different ways in which people are connecting the dots. The Tony Blair example is one, the Polycrisis group is another, because there's a lot of connecting of the dots there, and the conspiracy mongers represent a third way of connecting the dots, and I would say they all speak to the failure of politics adequate to our time. And to come back to something you mentioned, the one huge difference between polycrisis now and polycrisis in the early 20th century is the threat of species and planetary extinction, and a sense that the hopefulness that characterized the climate policies of, say, 10 or even 5 years ago are no longer present among us today. And even if people are not expressing despair about the climate crisis, although I think they are in their individual lives, one of the manifestations among our cohort, we know plenty of people our age whose children have made decisions not to have children because they don't want to bring children into a world that may not be able to support them in 30 or 40 years. So the way in which that type of thinking may fuel talk of the polycrisis, that is a legitimate reason for despair, and perhaps the question has to be put more forcefully and forthright, which is to say, given the circumstances that we're facing, given the temptations of despair, how does one proceed? How does one live? Not simply in a personal or therapeutic sense, but how does one proceed in a political sense? I've just read a manuscript by Danny Roderick, which is actually quite a hopeful take on the future of climate policy. Resting not on international organization, he thinks COPs has been a failure, and the only way forward is for the United States and China to lead the way, and China's doing its part. America was until Biden lost the election, and with Trump now in power, no longer is. But it actually offers a hopeful politics that is not mired in polycrises, that is fully alert to the complexity of the world. And it may be that we have to put the political challenge more forthrightly and more squarely, that we are living in a time of great fear about the future of the planet and the future of the species. And how do we develop a politics adequate to this moment that doesn't give in to despair seems to me a path that is very, very important and that we have not adequately grasped.
On this podcast, we spoke to Danny Roderick at the end of our series about ideas of globalization. And one of the things he's known for is his globalization trilemma. And you could say a trilemma is a kind of polycrisis. A trilemma is you can have these two things, but then you lose this thing. You can have these two things, but then you lose this thing. You can have these two things. So whichever way you turn, you're losing something that you value. It's kind of overwhelming, a trilemma, but it's not described as a polycrisis. It's a trilemma. It's a lemma. It's a language of questioning and choice, which, as you say, is so different. I go back to what you said earlier, the difference between an age of questions, overlapping questions, and an age of overlapping crises. It's also interesting. So I'm just reading a book which is called After the Spike, The Risks of Global Depopulation and the Case for People. And as I said, one of the things that feels dated about that original French version of polycrisis is one of the crises they explicitly talk about is the crisis of overpopulation. People are increasingly alive to the fact that we're entering an age of depopulation. And the argument of this book, among other things, is the worst thing you could do for the planet now would be not to have children. So it's totally understandable how people might feel that and fear it and not want it for themselves and worry about a future in which their children's lives will be intolerable and they'll have been responsible for it. But a depopulating world is a more dangerous world, actually, than a world where there is stable population. And, that seems to me a good example of the ways in which I completely understand how a polycrisis mindset would lead to the conclusion it's just too dangerous, and indeed it's unhelpful. More people means the crises get worse. But there are really interesting arguments that say if you take a step back and see it in a way that connects the dots differently, so it doesn't connect them in polycrisis language, but in a more pragmatic way, actually, and takes account crucially of timeframes, because that was the other thing I wanted to ask you about, is how much of this do you think in the later version, the late 20th, early 21st century version, is to do with a sense of acceleration? I think it's there in that original French idea of polycrisis, which is the accelerating pace of technological change. It's breakneck. And I think we all feel that. One of the responses to that, which feels to me a bit like the people who are looking for the clarifying event, is what's called accelerationism, which is let's speed it up even more so we can get to the point where we're sort of beyond the polycrisis and we're in the brave new world. And accelerationism has its early 20th century counterpart in futurism. And the futurists, A, they celebrated the First World War, and B, they became fascists. Now, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen to 21st century accelerationists, but it's hard not to see these parallels, that mindset, it does encourage, completely understandably, I think I have an accelerationist streak in myself. I want to see what's going to happen. I know people who say, what I really regret is I'm not going to live to see the world end. I know people who believe that sincerely. It could end in 5 or 6 different ways. It really annoys me that I'm unlikely to live long enough to see which of those is going to be the final death knell. I think there's a little part of me that speaks to, but it's dangerous, dangerous politics.
It's very dangerous, and I refer to that as catastrophist politics, and you hear it in various ways, sharpening the contradictions, right, and bringing things to a head. And this also comes out of a Hegelian or Marxist way of thinking, the thesis, the antithesis. You want to sharpen those forces, bring the clash sooner rather than later, because at the end of that clash lies a synthesis. We will be at perhaps a higher level. You hear this in politics now as people decide, well, in these difficult circumstances, how should we be behaving? Should we do coalitional politics? Should we have a reform politics? Should we have a radical politics? And I remind people of the decision that the German Communist Party made in the early 30s when they decided that the greatest enemy facing Germany was not Hitler, but the Socialist Party. And even though the Communist Party was the single most powerful political force in Germany at the time, they went after the socialists instead of building a coalition with them that would stop Hitler. And that remains for me a warning about catastrophist politics. And by catastrophist politics, meaning you hasten the path toward catastrophe, toward the biggest conflict that you can generate, because this will sharpen the contradictions and get us to a better place sooner. And history does not inspire confidence in me that that has yielded, on the whole, good results. And so what you mentioned earlier about, just to come back to Roderick for a moment, his trilemma, part of his points was you can't satisfy all 3 points on the trilemma. You have to choose. And so a politics of choice and a politics of pragmatism, and putting the question to the polycrisis group, well, which crises are we going to address first? Which are we going to relegate to a level of secondary importance? These seem to me to be important decisions to make in terms of paving a way forward.
How much of the problem with the idea of polycrisis do you think is not the poly bit? Because it's tempting to focus on that and think that sort of confuses the issue. I mean, what does it mean, the polycrisis? It's not one big crisis. Doesn't mean that, but it also means that they're all connected in some way. It feels unsatisfactory. But maybe the problem is the word crisis. I've spent quite a lot of time writing the idea of crisis, and there's a long, rich history. So this doesn't go back to the end of the 20th century, a long history of historians thinking about the problems with the idea of crisis, its ambivalence. I have a couple of problems with it, one of which is it feels to me like it's an inflationary language. So one of the things I did for a book I wrote, which was about the crisis of democracy, was to look back on the history through the 20th century of when people talked about the crisis of democracy. When did they think democracy was in crisis? And it turned out every year from 1900 to 1999, you could find someone pretty much saying, we're in the crisis of democracy. And at that point, it starts to lose some of its helpfulness, I think. But also in these historical accounts, people are really alive to the different ways in which a crisis can be understood. It has some connection with disease and the idea of the crisis of the disease. Well, the crisis of the disease the moment where the fever either breaks or it kills the patient, is very close to that clarifying event. The idea that what a crisis needs is a clarifying event. So maybe a polycrisis is going to lead to the poly-clarifying event, the one that pulls them all together. But in other ways, crisis is a background condition. When you live through a crisis, it's quite open-ended. It's very hard to say when it begins and when it ends. There's a part of me that feels part of the problem with polycrisis is it compounds the problems with the idea of crisis by it inflates an inflated idea, and it adds confusion to the confusion in the idea of crisis, which is this a thing that has a break point, or is this a thing which is an open-ended background condition to politics? Hence, every year is the crisis of democracy. Another term for the crisis of democracy is democracy. That's how it works, right? There's always someone who feels the sky is falling in. And the great thing about democracy is those people aren't silent. So there's a way of kind of arguing it out. So is it possible the problem here is actually the word crisis rather than the poly?
Yes, although if there were another crisis that happens every year, we might say men, we could say, are in crisis every year. Among historians of the United States, there's frequent recourse to men being in crisis. This happened because men were in crisis. This happened because men were in crisis. And I began at one point to add up all the years that men were in crisis, and I came to the conclusion that men are in a permanent state of crisis, and which may well be true.
And may well be appropriate.
May well be appropriate, but is not a very helpful way for understanding history and inflection points and changes in the direction of travel. I don't think we can eliminate the concept of crisis. I think there are moments of genuine crisis, but we risk rendering the term mundane and not very useful by invoking it all the time. And perhaps part of what we need to do now is to have a more rigorous definition of what constitutes a crisis and what does not, and to resist the temptation to multiply crises. So I don't think you were heading in this direction, but I would certainly not support eliminating crisis from our vocabulary and our tools of analysis. But I think we need to be much more careful in terms of how we deploy the term and do some rigorous thinking of what constitutes a crisis and what constitutes the normal give and take of politics and personal life. I mean, it applies not just to politics, but to ourselves and our families. We think of individuals being in crises. We sometimes think of ourselves as being in crises. I can think of people in my life who have been in genuine crisis, and that term is appropriate, and other times when that term has been applied inappropriately. So I think greater care in applying the term and perhaps some rigor in terms of defining what makes a problem or a question into a crisis. And I'm drawn again, I've been struck by the early 20th century reference to the problems and crises being questions. When Woodrow Wilson sails for Europe, he says the primary question confronting the world today is the labor question. The Bolshevik Revolution has happened. Wilson is worried about the spread of revolutionary socialism throughout Europe. And yet, I'm sure he's feeling that the world is on the edge of a crisis, but he's not using the terminology of crisis. And if you substitute question or problem for crisis, it already puts you on the road to thinking about solutions in ways in which the word crisis does not.
I mean, I think the problem with it was that it came to sound patronizing and worse, Marx, the Jewish question, the woman question. It sounds like these categories of people are being put in a box. It's othering, to use 21st century language. But maybe we should talk about the man question rather than the crisis of men. I think maybe that's entirely appropriate, that men should be put in a box in that way. I think, it'd be quite nice to see men patronized by the man question in the same way women were patronized by the phrase, the woman question. And I don't want to get rid of the language of crisis. I mean, because I believe it's a terminology that's prone to inflation. I don't want to abolish it any more than, the solution to the problem of inflation is to abolish money. It is, as you say, to be much more careful with it. One last thing I want to ask you, and this is to do with time, and it connects what we were talking about at the beginning with what we've been talking about more recently. It feels like, and this isn't just a problem with the idea of polycrisis, but maybe it's there in that terminology. It has its origins in the late 1990s in a very broad, long-term view of modernity, so a long story. And it's not about the time in which those writers were living, but their sense that something is happening if you see it across a broad span of time, where you can recognize the interconnectedness of these things, the mistake in that broad time frame of trying to isolate the one as the key. Because if you see it over a century, that starts to look like an illusion. And at the same time, the language of polycrisis seems to have really taken off in an age where political time speeds up. This is the age of instant news. I'm constantly struck. We've just lived through a 12-day war, and the coverage of it, it's absolutely breathless. The sense of the urgency of it, the imminence of something very dramatic and possibly terrible happening, then the end of this thing, and then immediately the question of has it ended? And the thing that's got squeezed, and this has got squeezed across the board in the 21st century, is the middle. We're living in a long tail world. And that's true of news and information and the way we think about what's important, the very long term, the immediate. But it's that middle ground where the hope, the early 20th century hope was found. People who thought they could do work over the next few years. And that's the thing that feels like it's gone. And I'm not sure the language of polycrisis helps with that at all. I think the language of polycrisis maybe feeds off an age where long-term planetary thinking and have you heard what's just happened thinking have squeezed out the time frame in which the politics we still have, democratic representative politics, has traditionally worked, which is over the cycle of years.
So from that perspective, part of the crisis we're living through, I hate to use this term given what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes, is a real democratic crisis in the sense that democracy may not be doable in this world of acceleration that defines the terms in which we're living. And so it may be that the deepest crisis is the crisis of democracy. I've just switched on to a book I haven't thought about in some time, but one time had a big influence on me, David Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity, which was a book written to make sense in a way of this moment we were living through. And he wanted to distinguish postmodernity from modernity, which he saw as the condition of much of the 20th century, and was trying to identify a different period that we were entering in the late 20th century and would overlap with the invention of the term polycrisis. In fact, they may be analogous, postmodernity and polycrisis, and it may be that postmodernity is a better way of thinking about the moment that we're in than polycrisis. And it's interesting to me that postmodernity was such a big part of the academy, especially in literature departments and English departments, for quite a number of years. And the techniques of that school were overused and misapplied, and it's just fallen away. But some of the conditions of postmodernity, the acceleration of time and the impact of that on politics, which was very central to what David Harvey was writing about, seem very relevant to the condition of our own lives. And this comes back to a point that I've been stressing in one way or another, not very articulately over the hour we have spent together, but the way in which politics has changed from the early 20th century to the early 21st century, and a change in the horizon of politics and what seems possible. And it may be that we are living in a condition of postmodernity that transforms the questions and problems of the early 20th century to immediate crises that surround us all the time, and for which we can not find a path through it or around it or a path of transcendence. Maybe the key question and the key crisis is that of democracy, living in a postmodern world where the tools of democracy that work so well for a certain period of time in the 20th century no longer can work the same magic.
I don't disagree with that. And having said there's a crisis of democracy every year, I'm still willing to accept that ours is in some ways categorically different. But I would resist, and this is the theme of what we've been talking about, folding it into the polycrisis, because there's a temptation to think this thing that we call democracy no longer works in an age where not just the time of politics has sped up, but these other kinds of time are also nagging away at it. It feels like it's the wrong framing, on the one hand for the climate crisis, on the other hand for endless breaking news. It's sort of caught between the two things. And therefore, there's a reason for thinking its inability to cope is just part of this wider crisis. Whereas there's a part of me that thinks, I've said it quite often on this podcast, the mistake we make is to think that this thing that we call democracy is the only way of doing democracy. And the way to respond to that is not to fold it into a polycrisis, but to say, well, let's find a democracy that suits the time that we live in. And we just don't do that. So one of the effects from 1999 till now, the age of the polycrisis, is that we've wrung our hands a lot about the inadequacy of our politics, but we just carry on doing it the same old way, waiting for the next election, shuffling these political parties, consulting voters in the same way, asking them the same kinds of questions. If you look at British politics today, you wouldn't know we were living in a polycrisis. You'd think, it's the same as it ever was. And I would say the response to the idea that democracy doesn't fit the times that we live in is not to fold it into a polycrisis. It's just to do it differently. Try something new. Try something new. Try lots of new things. Why not?
I would agree with that. And what it does, and I wasn't advocating folding the democratic crisis into the polycrisis.
I know you won't. I think that it's a good example of why the language of polycrisis is unhelpful here. I would agree with you. Let's focus on the democratic crisis and let's not let despair eat away at it.
And let us foreground the problem of politics in the 21st century and what we need to do in order to address the problems that confront us in a very serious way.
You sounded gloomy as you said it, but it's a cheerful note on which to end.
You want a more cheerful ending?
No. I never want a cheerful ending. We are approaching the end of this series of the history of bad ideas, but we have a couple more to come before we go back to politics on trial. And next time, I'm talking to the political philosopher Alan Finlayson about an idea that has had a long history, but also a very specific recent history. What's wrong with behaviourism? That's next. This has been Past, Present, Future.